This morning I am in Salt Lake City talking with Jessica Van Buren, who is the state law librarian of the state of Utah. Jessica, I believe you've been in a position since 2004. Prior to that, you were employed by the Alaska State Library. That's a bit of a change in climate, as I understand it.
It was.
Yeah. Well, as is our custom, before we start with the substantive parts, your career and what you do here at the library, that sort of thing, I always like to ask a little bit about you as a person. What your life was like perhaps when you were young and today.
Well, I was born in California, and when I was about a year old, my family moved to Japan because my father got a Fulbright scholarship to teach at a university in a town called Maebashi. And we lived there for 3 years. And when his time was up, then we moved to Hawaii, and that's where I grew up. From kindergarten through my first year of college, I lived in Hawaii.
We have some colleagues in Hawaii that I'm dying to figure out how I can get over there to talk to for this conversation. One of them, Leigh Seeger, is actually going to be in Seattle in about a week.
Oh, good.
And we're going to do her conversation for the video at the University of Washington. So that'll be sort of fun.
Yeah, although you'd rather go to Hawaii.
Well, it's my own fault if I don't go, because I could just get on the airplane and do it. But I haven't quite gotten myself to do that, at least not yet. Well, getting back to what we're supposed to be talking about, could I ask you a little bit about whether you have any particular hobbies or passions or other pursuits for perhaps while you're not at work?
Yeah, these days I do a lot of hiking. In the winter, snowshoeing, which is just hiking in the winter. Some cross-country skiing, although not as much as when I was in Alaska. It was really easy when I was in Anchorage, but here it's a lot harder. And then as part of that, I like to take photographs, so that's become one of my obsessions lately. When I'm hiking, my friends have to be very patient with me because I need to stop and take pictures of things.
Well, that all sounds fascinating. It's beautiful country around
It is.
here. I don't know, for some of our viewers who may not be familiar with the setting of the city, we're right up against the beginnings of the mountains, I guess the Rockies.
Yeah,
Wasatch.
it's the Wasatch Front is what it's called. The Rockies are a little further away, but what it means is within about 15 or 20 minutes from my house, I can be up at 6,000 feet or higher. If you drive a little bit more, 45 minutes, you're up at 10,000 feet, and the mountains are spectacular.
No, I'll bet.
And especially when it's too hot down here for me, that's a great place to escape to.
Well, I noticed it was quite warm and toasty in the city yesterday afternoon when I arrived, but this morning it was chilly for a while.
I think we're starting to change to fall. But yeah, that was the hardest part about the transition from Alaska to here. Is in Alaska, I thought the temperature was perfect. Summer temperatures, low 70s, that was great. And when I got here, it was I was afraid that when it would hit 100. It scared me. But I've gotten used to it, so now my tolerance is a little bit better.
A couple of days ago, I was down in Las Vegas, and it was like 112 or 113 one day down there.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah, I understand it's not quite that hot usually up here in Salt Lake
No,
City.
it's rare, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. It sounds like you have opportunities for photography. You must have had plenty in Alaska.
Well, what's funny is I didn't take photographs when I was in Alaska, and now I think, if I could go back and do that, it would be a completely different story.
Going to Hawaii, I could do it if I wanted to. You could go to Alaska if you wanted to.
Yeah, there's so many other places in the world I want to see, so.
That's right. Well, I noticed in looking over your background that you are a graduate of the law library program at the University of Washington, one of Penny Hazelton's proteges, I assume, is correct?
Yep, Penny was the director and ran that program.
Yeah. Could you tell us a little bit about your education and training?
I have an undergraduate degree in journalism from the University of Oregon. And when I finished undergrad, I was kind of aimless, and somebody said, you should go to law school. So I went to law school at the University of Oregon. Hated it. It was really 3 horrible years, but I stuck it out. And the whole time I was in undergrad and law school, I worked in either the main library or the law library.
Mhm.
And when I finished law school and really couldn't figure out what I was going to do, the librarians there told me about the program at UW.
So in a sense, did they play a part then in sort of recruiting you into
Not
the law
not
library
even
field?
in a sense. They are completely responsible for alerting me to this profession of
They
law
weren't even
librarianship.
subtle like some of
Oh,
the people
no,
I
they
dealt
said,
with.
hey, there's this great program. It's 1 year. You don't have to take the GRE, which was huge for me. And then you'll have this law librarianship degree. And I have, even to this day, when I see some of those people, I thank them for getting me into this profession because really it was the perfect match for me. I just had no idea that it existed, or, in law school they say you can do other things with a degree, but they don't talk about things like that.
A lot of times, especially in today's environment, a lot of the graduates do have to look a little more broadly than they once did, perhaps.
Yeah.
But that's the reality. You know, it's interesting. You and I share something in common now. We are quite a few years apart, unfortunately, but I too went to the University of Washington and through the library program, the law library program. And in those days, Marian Gallagher was the mentor and professor.
So
in
you were
charge.
lucky to have had her.
So I had her.
Mhm.
The program itself, she is not the one that initiated it. I don't know how much you know about it, but it was started actually around 1939 by Arthur Beardsley, who was Marion's predecessor. Arthur was more of a lawyer historian type, more of a scholar in that sense, less of an actual hands-on librarian, as the truth be told. But he'd been there since the 20s.
Wow.
And they had decided that, there was a need for people with this kind of training as law library collections were getting more sophisticated and larger, even in those days. There was a real need to have people with the right kinds of training to go in. Deans around the country were particularly concerned. Because in those days, states had state law libraries, and they hired these types of graduates. Law schools did, but the firm sector hadn't really much developed yet, although that happened later. And not, of course, everybody who was in a law library position had this kind of a background,
Right.
but there was a need at that point, it was seen, to have people who had both law and library specialized training in the field. Marion took the program over around the end of World War II. She was actually here in, I think, in Salt Lake City at the University of Utah for
Oh,
a while
really?
in her very
Hmm.
early days, right out of Beardsley's program.
Mm.
She had gone through that. And then she went back to Seattle, and that was the rest of her career. Penny, of course, succeeded her. I think Bob Baring was in there for a year,
Mhm.
and maybe somebody else on an interim basis before that. So Penny has run it now quite a while, modernized it as the times have changed and the needs have changed, and she went through what I understand is a very excellent program. And it was not
It
that
served
far
me
from
well.
Oregon where you went to school.
No.
How convenient, huh?
Well, there was that too, but yeah,
Yeah.
that's great.
Well, why don't we talk about your career? We've talked about your getting the degree. We've talked about how you sort of decided to become a law librarian. And it's great that our colleagues look out for all of us in the profession who come in after them by
That's
telling
true,
us
and I
these
try to
things.
do the same, to whisper that in people's ear. There's this program.
Mhm.
So when I graduated, I interviewed at a bunch of law school libraries. Didn't find anything, and then this job in Alaska came up at the court.
Uh-huh.
And I knew nothing about court libraries. I just never thought about them. But Alaska was certainly intriguing. Growing up in Hawaii, Alaska seemed about as exotic as it could get. And interviewed and got the job. And that was 12 fantastic years in a place that was every bit as exotic as I hoped it would be. But also because it was a small library, and in Alaska, there is no law school, so there's no law school library. The court library had 17 branches. Some of them were really more like a shelf in some judge's office. And then some of them actually had staff. But it was a great learning experience in how to deliver services remotely. And when I started, the internet was just getting started. Email was just getting started. So there are all these new ways of thinking about how to get that information out there. We relied on fax machines very heavily to deliver materials to attorneys in Barrow or whatever. I got a chance to visit some areas of the state through work to see some of those libraries. Because it was the beginning of the internet, I taught myself HTML and created the court's website. It was just this, crazy way to deliver information. Let's put it out there and let people come to it instead of having to have them come to us. And so I learned a lot. I wore a lot of different hats. It wasn't like an academic library where you have a CERT department and a tech service. Well, we had tech services, but it was not so fractured. So that I was public services librarian, and that meant I supervised some front desk staff, and I did reference, and I did interlibrary loan, and I did the website, and I did a lot of the technology and collection.
Almost everything.
And it was great because it wasn't boring. I could do a bunch of different things. It wasn't the same thing every day. And so I learned a lot. It was great, and it actually prepared me very well for this job because this is a small library. It's a staff of 4. Me, another professional librarian, and then 2 paraprofessional staff. And there are 2 law school libraries in Utah, the U and BYU, but their job is to serve their faculty and students. They're both open to the public, but that's certainly not what their focus is. So we're the one who takes care of that. But I already had experience in trying to do that remotely, and here we have the luxury of a few more roads than we did in Alaska, so you can actually drive to places. But still, you'd never make someone in St. George drive 4 or 5 hours to get something from here.
St. George, for those that are not up on the
Southern
geography,
Utah.
is way down, not very far from Las Vegas, actually.
That's true. It's your stop on the way to Las Vegas.
That's right.
So you wouldn't make somebody come in, and we've replaced the fax machine with scan and email, but it's the same concept that we can deliver stuff to people wherever they are. And what's interesting about how this, maybe how much things have changed in my career. In Alaska, when I first started, certainly very few self-reps, and we were pretty awful to them. When I think about it now, part of it was that sort of fear. You didn't know how to handle them, and you didn't have any resources for them. So if you could be mean to them, then maybe they would just leave you alone.
Go away.
Which never felt good. It was always kind of awful. When I was in Alaska, then they created a self-help center, and the director and I got to be really good friends and collaborated a lot, figuring out ways to deliver information on the website, and it really opened to my eyes to the whole service to self-represented parties concept. And so even by the time I left Alaska, we were rethinking some of those things, and when I got here, it's taken off in a big way. 86% of our patrons are public. I mean, that's just tremendous.
Now, you're here in Salt Lake City, but are these people from other parts of the state?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It doesn't matter where they are. They can call us, they can email us. Most of our patrons are here in the building. It's mostly foot traffic. But still, we don't make people come in. We do our very best not to make people come in if they don't have to. And what self-reps want is completely different from what an attorney would want, or what a judge would want, or what a law clerk needs. So this library has a very different character from the library in Alaska. And, maybe now the Alaska library is different too.
Times may have changed, although the idea of people representing themselves is certainly not new in our profession.
No, and in fact, I think that served me well here, because this court then started to acknowledge that self-reps are a problem for the court, or a reality, however you want to view it. But it
problem that needs to be addressed.
That you can't do what we did in the library in those early days, where you just be mean to people and then that'll take care of it. People deserve to be able to access this branch of government to resolve their disputes, and if they don't have the money, or for whatever reason they decide they don't want an attorney, they don't have one. And so to just deny it is not working. That wasn't working. And so the court created a committee, it's the Judicial Council's Committee on Resources for Self-Represented Parties. I was lucky to be one of the people who was on that committee, and our job was to figure out what we could do.
Mm-hmm.
And because of my experience in Alaska, we said, how about a self-help center? And
You didn't feel you should try and chase these folks off anymore.
no, no.
That's
And in self-defense, if more than anything else, a better prepared self-rep is easier on the entire system. If they have forms, if they can put their information into some kind of comprehensible order, it serves us, the court. In addition, of course, it then takes care of that access to justice concept that, that motivates me every day. I mean, I really get behind that. And so we patterned our self-help center pilot project after Alaska's because in some ways our geography is very similar. You have this Wasatch Front where we are, Salt Lake, and about 100 miles along the mountains here is the population center. It's where, I can't remember, 70 whatever percent of the population is along the Wasatch Front.
I noticed driving up the other night, it was the areas that I saw lights, which I'd driven through several hours of almost pitch black darkness coming up after I left St. George.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of empty areas that it gets very remote very quickly.
Yeah.
And then the resources really thin out. And in some communities, it might be the only attorneys available are the prosecutor and the defense attorney. And so how do other people get the help of an attorney? And so we went with a virtual model of phone, computer, a centralized self-help center model that would allow us to deliver services around the state. And actually, it's turned out to be around the world from a central point, cost effectively, not the California model where they staff those in every single court location and really expensive personnel-wise. And so that's been exciting. But the reason they housed it in the law library is because there's a long way to get around to it. What you said, law libraries are used to working with the public. We just know, we've developed the resources, we know how to talk to people. We're not afraid of the legal information versus legal advice thing because we're used to where that line is, comfortable with it, and okay with turning people away when it comes to it. Clerk's office staff, I think, tends to feel like everything that has a question mark on the end is really asking for legal advice, and there's so much more that information that you can give someone without getting to that point. And so they put it in the library, and it's been this perfect place for it. Great collaboration. And it's been tremendous. It's beneficial to the courts. The library benefits from it in a selfish kind of way that when we hit the limit of what we are able to do for someone, then we can refer them to the self-help center. We know we're serving people, and it's great.
You're very well located for doing this too, I think, because you're actually here in the courthouse where the trials and so on are all taking place. Unlike some of your counterparts at other state law libraries where perhaps it's in the Capitol or off to another site in a state building of some sort.
And this library did used to be in the Capitol long before my time, but about 20 years ago, before they built this building, we're in the Matheson Courthouse. It was housed, and it was called the Supreme Court Law Library, although in statute it's always been called the State Court Law or the State Law Library. And then 20 years ago, they built this building to bring together the two appellate courts then, which one of them was in a completely different building. So to bring together the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeals, then the trial courts, the juvenile court, the administrative office of the courts, and the law library. This building is the biggest courthouse in the state, and it houses on all these 5 floors that we've got, these various offices. And it is great to be here with all those different kinds of...
You're right in the middle of the action.
Or on the main floor.
Yeah. I think of the state law library in Washington State where I live. Actually, I live in Olympia, which is where the state capitol is. And they're in the Supreme Court building. We call it the Temple of Justice. That's the technical name of the building. And but, they're way away from the local courthouses. And, I mean, it's easy to find them and everything. The Capitol's right across the grass quad from them, and so you can always spot the dome and just zero in on it.
But you have to intend to go there, whereas here we get a lot of just referral traffic. They've gone to the clerk's office or they've come down from a courtroom, and they're told to come to see us.
Yeah.
And so that's great for us.
I imagine even some of your business is generated by appeals, people who get above
Sure.
the trial court. I
Sure.
remember in Texas, I spent 3 years there in my early days in this profession. And there, at the Supreme Court of Texas, there were a group of docket numbers that started off with the OC. And there were different docket numbers from the normal docket numbers of most of the cases. And one time my boss, Al Coco, and I were up there, and we were chatting with one of the justices or somebody just offhand. And we asked about what these docket numbers that started with OC were. And he laughed and said, well, those that stands for our clients. They're mostly the pro se people.
Huh.
And they submit their information and their documentation in the appeals, because they're handling only appeals at that level. And sometimes they need a little additional legal help, so we have our clerks,
Wow.
Do a little additional work behind the scenes on these things, so we can make some proper judgments in those cases.
Yeah.
And he said they're again, our clients, so the dockets are OC in the number. It's an interesting story. There are probably similar sorts of things every place.
I think our court bends over backwards to give the self-reps the benefit of the doubt, but there's no denying that trying to do your own appeal is really hard. The self-help center does serve all levels of court, so if someone's got an appeal and they've got questions about it, they can call.
Yeah, I'm not sure Texas had a self-help center in those days. Maybe they do now, but
I don't think not yet.
yeah. Although the judges wanting to do the right thing had seen to us that some of these people were given a little help.
Yeah.
And that was probably actually good, as long as they could figure out how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, we've been talking about the library, and I keep hearing stories around about I think it's been described by our colleague Frank Hodak as difficult times for the economy generally and the legal profession in particular, including those of us that work with them in law libraries. Has some of this adjustment, which has also come at a time of tremendous change in the ways we can provide legal materials. You've talked about the technology you use every day to reach out to the state. And obviously it's not all just books anymore on the shelf. Now there are all sorts of digital media as well.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any thoughts about the changes and how that might be affecting you here at the library and law libraries, state law libraries particularly, more in general?
Well, because so many of our patrons are the public, the things they need, as I mentioned before, are completely different from what a judge needs or an attorney needs. And so very few of them are wandering back to our very modest collection of treatises and journals and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it was interesting because when I got here, I figured it was going to be a traditional model, but it became apparent that they're far more interested in the things we have up front, which are the computers. Mm-hmm. Because they're goal-oriented. They want to get divorced, or they want to enforce that custody order. So they don't need the theory of it. It's forms and information that they're interested in. So what we do a lot is talk to people about civil procedure. I never imagined I would master civil procedure the way I have, or really get it and be comfortable with it, because I didn't particularly enjoy that class.
Well, you did take it in law school.
Oh, of course, we had to.
Oh.
We had to, but then it was so theoretical, and here I can see why we have those rules, and I can explain to people what's expected of them, and just talk about that really comfortably. But what that means is, and I've reorganized the books, the collection, a couple different times in the nearly 10 years that I've been here. Every time with an eye towards trying to get the things that people use the most closer and pushing back the things that they don't. And it's undergone 2 or 3 different giant shifts because it keeps changing. So when I first got here, the goal was to get the treatises out from as far away back as possible and pull them closer to the front. And but the journal still had an important role, and the reporter still had an important role. Now the reporters are pushed to the back because they're all stopped except Pacific. I've canceled every single reporter because
So everything you rely on Westlaw? and
absolutely, we
Lexis?
use Westlaw now.
Yeah.
For the handful of attorneys that still use this library,
Mhm.
we put them on Westlaw for newer cases. And I think Westlaw works great, Westlaw or Lexis, either one,
Sure.
online works great for cases.
Mhm.
And same thing with journals. We've always just had a modest collection of journals anyway, but with Hein Online, I'm able to really get way more of a collection than I ever could have, back to volume 1, and it's easier to use online than it is in print. I'm still kind of old-fashioned about treatises. I'm not yet at the point where I'm willing to go electronic on those. I still have, it's modest, but still have the treatises for the handful of attorneys and then the judges and law clerks. But the other thing is, I can't afford to buy a whole lot. And when I give tours anymore, I tell students, the new law clerks, the just graduate students, that this is not like their law school libraries at all. We are teeny weeny in comparison. But the U and BYU are very generous with us, and if they need something that we don't have, I contact them, and sometimes within minutes, but certainly in a very timely manner. I have the sections they've asked for, or if we need to borrow something, they're really generous with us that way. So it's that idea of, just in time instead of just in case. That totally applies to us here. And then just the generosity of those two law school libraries. We've not yet come up against something that I couldn't get one way or another when we needed it.
Mhm.
So it's interesting. It's changed. It doesn't bother me. It's just, you every once in a while you need to stop and take a look and decide whether what you're doing still makes sense. And that's why we would move the books around, because why are we emphasizing this? These are a bunch of lap subscriptions. Why would we put them up front? It changes the tour a lot.
Yeah.
I wave at books and say, well, these aren't updated anymore. These aren't updated anymore.
Well, it's been described that today's law students will be sitting at a table like we are this morning, and with books behind us, like you can see behind you on the shelves here. And yet, if what they're looking for is not on some sort of a screen in front of their faces, they don't think it exists.
Or if it's not the first one or two results. I noticed that in Alaska too, that I started to worry about how the new lawyers were understanding how law was organized.
Mhm.
And it was that idea that if they just found one case and they figured it's good enough without realizing they were so close to getting the real case that they wanted or needed, that the quality of the opinions was going to be declining, and then that means the law, I don't know, it was just...
I remember in the old days, we had what was known as shepherds, and in those days, they were big paper volumes, and you had to
One of
use
the
the
first
main
things I
volumes,
canceled.
and then the
Yeah.
supplements,
Yeah.
and the little tiny paper thing that came every couple of
Mhm,
weeks. And
mhm.
now it's all online. and-
Right, so
and
they
it
can-
works much better, but it sounds like some of them don't use that properly
Yeah, I
either.
try not to ask too much about it, but it does mean and I still want them to come to the library for the tour. And when I say them, I mean the law clerks,
The clerks,
the appellate, the trial court law clerks here in Salt Lake don't turn over the way law clerks traditionally do, but the
Mm.
appellate law clerks still do. And I want them to step foot in the library, one, to sort of see that there are people here, to help them and to show them that we have some books, but then also really to emphasize the point about, hey, it looks small, but we can get other things too. But I wave at reporters and things, and I'm just not sure how much they understand about the mechanics of the topic and key number system and all of that. It's interesting.
It's hard to be sure. Now, it's interesting, this may be an inappropriate question, and if so, just tell me, but in the old days, you had the books sitting on the shelf, you had the reporters and the cases and so on. Somebody would come in who was, interested in looking at some of those, would just go take it off the shelf and open the book, and there were no fees, copyright problems, none of that. Today, you've dropped most of the reporters, except for the local ones and maybe the Pacific in paper. Obviously, someone comes in, needs a case from, say, Maryland or Texas or what have you, has to rely on access through the digital media. How do you fund that kind of thing, if I can dare ask, for some of these people? Do they have to paid the fees? I know the companies are not in the business of giving away the databases for free.
Right, so we have a public access Westlaw. It's just part of our budget. We offer public access Westlaw, so we provide access. So if they need a Maryland case, they can use Westlaw to get it. We do charge to copy or to print. So if they're going to print out that case, they need to do that. Our Westlaw plan now allows people to download to a flash drive or email it, so if they want to do that, they can do that too. Westlaw makes sure that there are limits so nobody goes crazy. And we don't have a ton of use. And it's not a resource I generally point the public to. I'm not saying that they cannot use it, it's just there. But it's not, I'm still more comfortable with print books for
I think
things like
in this
statutes.
line of questioning, I was thinking about things that are not available in print books, certainly not here in this library.
Okay,
and
so
lesser
maybe more our appellate law clerks.
Mhm.
Then we're just working with the U or BYU and then, the copyright where I'm not requesting something, so many issues of a particular journal or something so that I'm pushing up against that at all. It's not that kind of.
Well, you have some sort of a budget for some of this.
At this
if need
point,
be.
I have not yet had to pay for something from somebody else.
All right.
And I think that's because between the U and BYU, they have had what I needed. If it came to the point where it was I needed to pay $45 to get something, I would turn back to the court and say, this is what it costs.
Mhm.
And I would expect them to pay for that. But I haven't had to do that yet, knock
Okay.
on wood.
Well, I know this is probably a much broader problem than here at the Utah State Law Library, actually. Because in the old days, people could come in, as I said, and look at the books, and if they wanted copies, we had photocopiers for a certain fee, and they just were expected to pay that themselves. But, it's not like a nickel a page to look at something on Westlaw these days, I'm sure.
Well, to look at stuff, free.
Yeah, we'll look at it,
Yeah.
but make a copy.
Yeah,
So.
yeah.
That sounds interesting. Well, Jessica, we've been talking about a lot of interesting things today, and I appreciate your contributions to our history of what we're all about as law librarians. But before we come to the end of the conversation, I'd like to ask if there's anything that we haven't talked about that you'd like to bring up.
Not that I could think of.
Well, that's good. We've covered the waterfront then, maybe, and a bit more. Well, then, on behalf of our colleagues, Michelle Wu, Frank Hodak, and Dick Spinelli, and on behalf of myself, I want to thank you for being part of today's conversation for the Oral History of Law Librarianship, which is part of the Spinelli's reference shelf on Law Library reference shelf on Hein Online. Thank you.
Thank you.